guys, welcome back to my channel. I read a total of 9 books in May. 2 of them were from school, and then the rest of them were for my own enjoyment. So let's get the ones that I had to read right out of the way. So I read The Invention of Solitude by Auster. This was for one of my creative nonfiction classes that I took in school. I liked the first half more. It's divided into 2 parts. The first part is called The Portrait of an Invisible Man, and the second part is called The Book of Memory. I found the first part to be much more engaging because it kind of went more chronologically a little bit, and it explored the relationship between the author and his father, while the second part was more abstract in my terms. There was more disjointedness to the second part, but I think that was intentional. The second book that I read was The Situation in the Story by Vivian Gornick. This was what we used as a template for our creative nonfiction writing. So basically it just it discusses how to write the essay and the memoir. So it's just a pretty good book if you want to pick up and you want to understand a little bit more on what the genre of creative nonfiction is and how to start writing it. I found it very interesting, but since it was mostly used as a textbook, I didn't exactly enjoy reading it. So the third book that I read in May was A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. This is a classic. I think it's considered a classic now, even though it was written in the 1900s. This was given to me as a gift a long time ago, and I never thought to pick it up because at that point I really wasn't interested in classics. But I picked this up this month because I had actually read a story that referenced this book, and the way they referenced it was so interesting that I wanted to pick it up myself. The author could have chosen to follow the same stereotypes of a deadbeat alcoholic father and a hardworking mother who tries to take care of her children, but I think she transcended those stereotypes. One of the reasons why is that I think in the foreword it says that the author was going to write this as like a biography or a memoir of her life, but then she was told to turn it into a fiction story. So much of the author's life informed this novel and the characters, so I think that helped a lot in making them feel more real. I especially liked the relationship between Francie and her father, Johnny. Even though he is an alcoholic, he's unlike some of the many typical alcoholics that you would think to see that are portrayed in media. He becomes kind of like a solitary, quiet, almost, I think, kind of a sweet disposition when he is under the influence, but he's unable to hold a job. He kind of works as like a as needed waiter, a singing waiter, I think it describes him as, and he doesn't have a steady job, so he doesn't have a steady income for the children. It's really the mother who provides the income for the family. It talks a lot about how she's a scrubbing woman. She scrubs the floors, and even though she's described as a very beautiful woman, her hands are like cracked and scarred from her work. So she's ashamed of her hands a lot of times when they're brought up. It was a very good novel because it also talked about the shame and the judgments that people cast upon those that grow up in poverty, and even those who grow up in poverty, the shame that they cast on themselves and the way that they hide their background. I found that all very interesting to read about in this story. Really connected to the main character, Francie Nolan, and I wanted her to succeed in life because she's a book reader, and she found escape through books as well. There were a lot of really funny interactions where she went to the library and she talked a lot about how she would always request a book for a 9-year-old, and the librarian would give her the same 2 books, and the librarian never realized that it's the same girl asking for this recommendation. And I really liked how this novel brought up a lot of these tiny small moments, and they really came to life in my eyes. I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. I would definitely recommend reading it. So the next book that I read is The Glass Castle by Jeannette. This was a memoir that I picked up because I read A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. I was kind of in the mood for books and stories that talked about that kind of subject. So I picked this up because I had actually found it at a thrift store a couple years back, and I was hooked by the first the prologue where the author is in New York and she's going to like a fancy party or something, I think, and she sees her mother rooting through the trash in the alleyway as her taxi cab stops at a light. And I just thought that was a very gripping and very interesting beginning, because I'm like, not many people that I know experience that. It's told very unflinchingly without, it doesn't really stop to make any judgments on what's going on in Jeannette's life or anything like that. It's just her memoir, her story of her life growing up as a child. And I think that the way it's told almost completely through her view at the time she was, at the age she was when she was going through whatever was happening. The part that I liked the most about the book is that it allowed the reader and allowed Jeannette to really show us the complicated feelings she had toward her parents. There were times that I wanted to strangle her parents, and then there were times that I sort of understood the familial bond and the love that Jeannette had with her siblings and with her parents, despite the very harsh circumstances and the very strange upbringing that they had. Parents were not what you call model parents. They didn't believe in regular school. They often ran from what they would call the bill collectors, or the feds, I think. They were actually bill collectors, but they called them the feds. And the children were sleeping in boxes, and there were many times there wasn't enough food to go around. And as the reader, you kind of want to make judgments on the parents for not being able to provide money, and I did often. But then Jeannette would come around, and then she would show these moments where she felt all the complicated feelings that you could feel towards someone: anger, frustration, disappointment, love, all those feelings toward a parent, just magnified by the complexity of their situation. They move a lot when she's young, and then when I think she's in her preteen years, they settle in one spot, and that's where you really kind of feel the need, the hope to escape the situation that she's in, and you really begin to root for the characters. I really enjoyed this book. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars, and I have already recommended it to many of my friends that do read, and I would recommend it to you for sure. So the next book that I read was The Immortalists by Chloe Benjamin. I borrowed this from the library because the premise itself seemed very interesting to me. It talks about 4 children that go and visit a fortune teller in New York City, and instead of telling like conventional fortunes, like who you're going to marry, who you're going to fall in love with, what career you're going to have, this fortune teller tells them the day that they're going to die. Now, I don't know about you, but as a kid, I would not want to go see someone who would tell me the day I was going to die. As to be expected, this, even though a lot of them shake this off as nothing, there are some of these children that are deeply affected by finding out what day they're going to die, and it really kind of influences the decisions they make throughout the book. So this book is interesting because at the beginning it starts out with all 4 of them and their perspectives, but then it follows, each part of the book is the narrative of that sibling. So it goes like Simon is the first, and then I can't remember the other names because I didn't really enjoy this book. I thought the book was going to be very different from what it was. In my mind, I thought there was going to be more magical realism in it, and there wasn't. It was more like realistic fiction with just a little dash of the magic, and even then, you don't even know if the magic is real. It's like it goes along the discussion of about how whether or not the decisions that they made were what brought them to their death, or whether there was any way that they could change it, whether their death was already foretold. So I thought that was very interesting, but I didn't really like a lot of how the author chose to write her characters. It was a very intense novel, very depressing to me to read, so I would just say that I did not enjoy that novel. Next up, I read One of Us is Lying by Karen N. McManus. I think I said that right. So this is just a book I picked up because I was going through the slightest slump during May, and I wanted to read something kind of fast, and thriller books to me are always something that I can read through like that, because like they're meant to keep you going. So this is a story about 4 individuals in high school, and they end up in detention with a 5th individual named Simon, and Simon posts like a gossip column that he talks about all of the lurid things that goes on in high school, and most people do not like him because he posts things that they want to keep secret. Well, what happens is during this detention, he dies of an anaphylactic shock, and then the 4 individuals left in the detention, they are murder suspects. So it's very interesting because the whole book, you kind of learn, at the beginning, these people kind of seem like stereotypes. But then as you go further through the book, I think the author does a really nice job of deconstructing the stereotypes, or at least going deeper into our characters so they feel more real than just their superficial selves. So I really liked reading this book, and I liked it so much that I'll actually pick up the sequel. I especially liked one of the relationships that happened in this book. I'm not going to say who it was between because that might be a spoiler, but I really enjoyed it and I shipped it. And yeah, I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read was The Martian by Andy Weir. I think that's how you say his name. I don't like science fiction. I know I may have mentioned that before, so I wasn't ever going to pick up this book. I'd heard about it a couple years back. My one friend read it and she raved about it. She was like, you have to read this. It's like, okay, I better pick it up. So I picked it up from my library and I read it. And I thought it was very interesting. There was a lot of science and a lot of math that went on. And being a science major myself, I kind of caught flashbacks to my intro physics class and my intro chemistry class. And some of those flashbacks were not good. I think that the author did a really nice job of breaking down whatever he was talking about in ways that a layman could understand. And even if a layman couldn't understand, someone could appreciate all of the research and the work that he put into the story. And I really liked it because I actually found it very touching, because there's just something, I am terrified of space, but there's just something about a lone man stuck in space, a lone human being without anyone around, on the planet of Mars, being stuck there, having to use their own ingenuity to survive, and going against the reality of that they're probably not going to survive and that they're going to end up dead as their food runs out. I found that survival story very interesting. I don't read a lot of survival stories, but this one was touching on several levels, because not only does it follow this man, it follows the NASA, it follows NASA here back on Earth, and their struggles as they realize that the man that they pronounced dead on Mars is actually alive, and how the heck they're going to try and bring him supplies and get him back home. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. So the next book that I read in May was Nevernight by Jay Kristoff. This was a book I would have never picked up myself if a friend hadn't recommended it to me, and I was in the mood for something fantasy. This is actually what I would call, it is fantasy, but it's a little bit darker than some of the fantasies I've read. And I don't know if this is marketed as young adult or adult, but I would definitely put it in the adult fantasy category, because there's a lot of language, graphic descriptions of violence and sex. The main character's name is Mia Corvair, I think that's how you say her name, and she is an assassin, or training to be an assassin, and she's trying to get revenge on her father's killers. So even that in itself is a very interesting premise. I really like the world that Jay Kristoff creates. It's very gritty, it feels dark, it really pulls you in to the suspense of the story. I had actually a little bit of trouble reading this. I started this in March, and I put it down after a while because I really wasn't a fan of the way Jay Kristoff writes. He writes, and this has been mentioned before by numerous people, he writes in a very kind of flowery prose, but almost not, and he uses a lot of weird metaphors. At some point he compares someone's beauty to a fresh suicide, which I'm not sure what that's supposed to be, but I didn't like that at all. He also calls someone smiles like a silverware smile, and then what he does is that he would refer to that same character with that same metaphor that he used throughout this book, and I found that kind of annoying after a while because I didn't really understand what the metaphor meant in the first place. So if you kept referring to it, it's something I didn't understand or like. Most of the characters in the book I kind of liked. None of them I absolutely loved. Mia herself was a little bit hard for me to get behind, because she seemed to follow a lot of that tropes of like, I'm not like other girls. I mean, understandably, her life became very difficult after her father died. She was a harsh character, and I kind of was won over to her by the end, but in general, none of the characters really stuck out to me. I enjoyed the book. I really liked the plot. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars because even though I really didn't like the writing style and I didn't really enjoy the footnotes that he uses, I thought it was a very interesting world, a really interesting enough characters that I was invested, that I like want to learn more about them, but none of them that I would really care either way whether they lived or died, which sounds awful, I know, but I've read so many fantasy books that sometimes I just read stuff for fun, and this is a book that I could see me picking up for fun again, even though the premise and the story itself is so dark. The last book that I read in May was The Queen of the Tearling by Erika Johansen. I actually just tried reading this book a very long time ago, probably when I was in high school, and I got maybe like this much through it, okay, and then I put it down because it was just, the reason why I think I couldn't get into it then and I was able to get into it now is that I just have a lot more time now, and this book is very much driven by political intrigue to me, character development, like exploration of characters and what drives them. It's a lot about building up the kingdom and less about like some of that actiony stuff. There's a lot of stuff that's happening like behind the scenes that's in this book, and there's a lot of mystery going on. So the story is the main character is named Kosia, and she's like a princess who is going to be the last queen of this country or kingdom called Tearling. There's a lot of mystery surrounding her mother and what her mother did when she was queen, and the villain in this story, and there's mystery around what her mother did to appease this villain, which is revealed later on in the story. And there's a lot of distrust between Kosia and her guard, the queen's guard, and she kind of has to win them over, along with winning over some of the people in her kingdom and getting them to trust her, because she's only 19 years old at the beginning of this book. And I found that this time around it was very gripping to me because I seem to be more invested in character arcs within books now and less about plot. Like, you need to have good plot to keep me interested, but now I'm also like, you need to have good characters to keep me interested as well. So I really enjoyed this book. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.